welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You basically see a screen here. This gentleman, his name is called Keith Williamson, Head of Dispute and Investigation for Asia. Keith, I must say, you do basically look like you're in a setting of a newsroom, that you're about to basically deliver some exciting news for us. No, I know Keith, and I actually met Keith many years ago when he actually frequent speaker and also spoke at a lot of my events on investigation, digital forensic investigations as well. Keith, before we kickstart, just basically like to warm up some of the conversation first. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just join us, again, if you basically have any questions, do put it in the Say Something Nice column, or you can basically ask the questions by clicking that button. So throughout the conversation for this particular session, it's all about investigations in global lockdown. But before we come to that, Keith, a few weeks ago, I think maybe about a month and a half ago, we met, and we talked about new risks that emerge in Asia Pacific and also basically around the world. And we and actually a bit more like 3 months ago. And that wasn't basically the crisis and pandemic hasn't happened yet. So how big of this new risk it has become so far in a investigation point of view?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeffrey. Well, I think the risks we talked about 3 months ago have all come to fruition in terms of we were talking about areas of high risk of fraud, which we were expecting just because of the imminent global financial crisis, and in particularly in this region that may have resulted from the China trade war with the US and just the general downturn in the economy. So there were 3 areas we're expecting to see more of during times like this. And with the pandemic as well, we're seeing a lot more of that. So firstly, we're expecting to see more financial statement fraud. Obviously, management will be facing huge pressures to keep their businesses alive in the current times, to maintain the confidence of customers, suppliers, investors, banks, and other stakeholders. And they'll be tempted more than ever to manipulate their financial results to present a brighter financial picture. Then I think we also talked about misappropriation of assets. Clearly, employees, individuals will also be under increased personal financial pressure and face increasing temptations and opportunities to misappropriate assets. And then thirdly, we're going to see more bribery and corruption. Businesses are facing an incredibly competitive environment for their goods and services at the moment. And this, combined with the financial stress they're under and the personal financial pressures of their employees and other companies' employees, will inevitably lead to more bribery and corruption to secure or retain contracts or obtain other business advantages.
Okay, I also read a lot of reports, and recently a lot of companies go under or basically going through liquidation or turnaround, and that actually prompted a lot of issue coming out. And like I said, 3 months ago we talked about new risk. We also talk about a cyber risk as well. Company being attacked, and and another segment of what we do is cyber attack. And we also basically see a lot of, because of working from home, number of companies keep getting attacked, and some can attack twice in 1 month. Because of vulnerability, etc., and that sort of thing. And I believe that you yourself, Chris, and also Davin is going to talk to some of this new risks, as well as basically how companies should basically start their investigations, etc. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Chris and Davin later on will speak to some of those cyber risks, but it's clearly an area we've been seeing more of in terms of attacks on individuals and corporations.
Okay. I'd also like to thank this opportunity because Keith and Davin and also Chris basically been feeding me a lot of intel on cases, and also basically support us to basically come up with different research and such. The Sea Integrity event in Hong Kong is supposed to take place in May, but it didn't take place in May because of the social distancing, also the pandemic. We will basically resume a live conference where people can actually shake hands and meet each other in November this year. And I do hope that we can actually have more case study and intel to show them. Without further ado, pass it on to you, Keith. Go ahead.
No, thanks very much, Jeffrey. So as I mentioned already, there are 3 main areas there we're seeing a lot more activity, and we're expecting to see a lot more activity over the coming months. Now, while these fraud issues are not new as such, the ability of companies and stakeholders to prevent, detect, and investigate them has been subjected to significant challenges in the current environment, where a lot of the global population now in key markets is working from home and or unable to travel. Now, in this webinar, Davin, Chris, and I will talk through some of the lessons we are currently learning from these challenges in the course of our forensic investigations. I'm going to first touch on some of the challenges we are facing conducting investigations in the current environment. Davin is then going to talk in more detail about how we are dealing with the technical challenges that arise in these investigations, before Chris then closes with a discussion of what an effective compliance framework looks like in the face of these challenges. So firstly, travel restrictions. Now, I mean, every day countries around the world are introducing new measures or amending or relaxing existing measures, restricting people's ability to travel, to work from their offices, or otherwise go about their everyday business. Like all other aspects of our lives, this is having an impact on how we go about conducting forensic investigations into fraud and other issues. Now, cross-border investigations ordinarily require an on-the-ground presence in multiple countries or regions of countries. Now, with the travel restrictions that we currently have in place across borders and even between provinces in China, for example, this has created challenges in attending client sites, even when their offices have been open. Now, while ordinarily you can supplement your investigations team in one location with resources that's experienced from another location, where forensic resources have been stretched or unavailable in particular locations, firms like ours have had to look to supplement those teams on urgent matters with resources with different skill sets that are available locally. So, for example, tax accountants or transaction advisory accountants. We've also had to seek to obtain access to company personnel, data and documentation remotely, and we've even had to delay certain aspects of investigations. Now, if you do supplement your existing team of experienced resources with less experienced resources, it's important that these team members are thoroughly briefed on their involvement in terms of things like evidence handling protocols, dealing sensitively with witnesses and suspects alike, paying very much close attention to detail, and maintaining confidentiality. Fraudsters can often spot and manipulate inexperience or uncertainty, so it's important that the investigation team maintains control and is not sidetracked by diversionary tactics. Now, secondly, dealing with delays. Sometimes it may be necessary to delay aspects of investigations until critical legal and forensic investigation team members are available to do things like conduct interviews or have access to certain data and documentation. However, more commonly we encounter delays in investigations from client company resources that are required to facilitate the smooth running of the investigation. In ordinary times, we face delays to due to purported business trips, for example, doctor's appointments, and vacations of key client staff. We can often request that pressure is exerted on these by senior management so that these plans can be changed to facilitate the efficient progress of an investigation. However, when the reasons for the delay are office closures, quarantine measures, and even working from home protocols that are resulting from COVID-19, it's very difficult to push back on these reasons and enforce the cooperation we require. Again, this may require us to rely on obtaining access to personnel, data and documentation remotely. And when the investigation team is out of sight, it's often out of mind, and the responsiveness of client company staff to request for assistance can often be further delayed. Now, thirdly, access to original documentation. In an ideal investigation scenario, we would have access to original documentation supporting the transactions that we're looking at. This enables us to better assess the authenticity of the documentation and the contemporaneous nature of its production. It's much easier to forge copied or scanned documentation than it is to do originals. Scanned or copied documentation doesn't afford us the opportunity to check the back of the documents, either for annotations or for some other relevant support that's attached there. We don't get to see the new staples that have been attached to show that there is new support that's being produced. We don't get to see the marks of the old staples that were there, where there was some pre-existing support. We also don't get to check whether approval signatures appear to be original or scanned on or copied. And we don't get to see whether there's been any other changes that have been made to that documentation. So investigation work that's been performed in this manner will need to be qualified in this regard, and or supplemented by additional work to corroborate the authenticity of the documentation that's been provided. So, for example, by seeking more independent third-party evidence. Fourthly, looking at conducting interviews. When face-to-face communications are difficult or impossible due to COVID-19 measures, this means that interviews may need to take place remotely. Where such interviews are informational in nature and are just designed to understand processes, policies, procedures, and controls, then this shouldn't cause too many difficulties, although it can sometimes lead to misunderstandings, and it can be more difficult to build the type of rapport that best facilitates sufficient performance of the investigation. Where interviews are key to establishing the knowledge or otherwise of the key individuals about facts and evidence that we've uncovered during the course of the investigation, a video or a voice call with multiple participants can often be clunky and often unproductive. And this gives the interviewee an element of comfort and control that they wouldn't ordinarily have in a face-to-face situation. I'm sure many of you have taken part in interviews by video or voice call in the past, where the interviewee always happens to have some sort of sound issue when the key challenging questions are being asked to them. And this enables them to buy time to think of credible answers rather than being on the spot in the same way that they would be in a face-to-face interview. Now, not being face-to-face also makes it difficult to assess body language in the same way during those challenging points of the interview. So careful consideration therefore needs to be given to whether to wait to hold such interviews in person where possible, or press ahead with a less than ideal remote interview, where at least some of the legal team or the forensic team can be present in person. This would always be preferable. So finally, in terms of obtaining access to electronic data, as I've alluded to already, access to electronic data held by the client company, for example, accounting or transactional data or emails of key staff, is always essential in performing investigations. Now, luckily, we have Davin here, who's the head of our forensic technology team, and he's going to talk through now how we can deal with some of the challenges that this throws up on our investigations.
Hi, Davin. How are you? Can
Hi,
we give a welcome applause to Davin, please? Davin, go ahead.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks, and thanks, Keith, for the handover. So the use of technology in an investigation is very much now being brought to the forefront due to COVID-19. This is due to the fact that data still needs to be collected, it still needs to be preserved, analyzed, reviewed, and ultimately produced for an investigation. Where does the data reside? How do you go about collecting it? Where do you store it after it's collected? These are just some of the challenges that I want to address with you. So knowing your data for data preservation. Within a company, it's always important to know where your data resides for each employee, your server environment, and to have an up-to-date asset management system. In the context of an investigation, this is even more important for the forensic technologist, as we rely on those asset management systems to track and trace employees' data within an organization and to target specifically that data for our collection. Within a COVID-19 world, where we can't come on site to confirm this data, whether an employee has a laptop or a desktop, whether they still use it or not, whether they have a company phone or a personal phone to their use. Do they use that for business data? Were they issued a USB device? What else is in their possession during that time of an investigation? We have to now rely on the company's IT to inform us of this, or even the employee during COVID-19. Ultimately, if a company can identify in a timely manner where their employees' data is kept, this enables our IT team to capture it more efficiently and to enable us to be able to work through that process in an efficient manner and ultimately save the client money. In a COVID-19 world, though, delays will occur, as Keith mentioned before, partly because we can't go on site to confirm a lot of these areas. So now, the data has been identified. How do you go about collecting it if we can't go on site? This goes on to my next point about conducting remote collections with all these restrictions. The electronic evidence in an investigation may be financial data, ERP system data, critical PDFs from a laptop, deleted pictures from a mobile device, or even TikTok videos from social media. These are just some of the data points that are critical pieces of a puzzle in an investigation. Now, unfortunately, in the new world we live in with lockdowns, travel restrictions, and travel bans, forensic IT professionals now need to implement what we call remote forensic collection methodologies. But what does it actually mean to collect remotely and to do a forensic collection in this manner? It means to preserve electronic evidence for an investigation whilst not being able to be on site or be present with the data physically. Though one still has to use best practices in forensic collections while still maintaining a full chain of custody to preserve the integrity of the data. And that's critical in a piece for a forensic technologist. That all sounds straightforward in theory, but there are many hurdles that we face in this new norm, such as logistically, how do you organize getting the data from a custodian if they're working from home? If we delay it too long, does this give time to the employee to potentially delete important data for their investigation on their devices? Have we been actually provided the correct data from the individual? Was there any data that's missing? What else could have been in that office that we wanted to collect if we were physically on site? Obviously, the inability to go on site now does slow down the process of the collections. If we were able to go on site or speak to the individual face-to-face, that would speed up the process. Now, with COVID-19, we have had to rely a lot more emphasis on the company's IT to inform us of this correct information. One other challenge could simply be, as Keith mentioned before about video conferencing, the key individual that we're trying to collect data from might just merely not even join the conference call that we want to have with them. Now, pre-COVID-19, for us as forensic technologists, the element of surprise is critical in order to collect data without tipping off individuals. Obviously, within the new COVID world we live in, that's not unfortunately possible. So now, in the COVID-19 environment we are all faced with, we have to rely on the cooperation, the coordination virtually with in-house counsel, external counsel, HR, and IT for an important, successful collection and investigation. Over the last 4 months, our team has seen definitely an uptick in demand to assist our clients in these types of matters, partly because of having a local team presence and a local data center presence in key areas and regions across Asia. Which move on to my next point in relation to having a local team and a local data center presence. A good example of that is in China, for example, where we have a local team presence and a local data center presence. For many months, travel between even provinces within China was restricted, and only in the last week or two, travel between Beijing and Shanghai was opened up. And even then, it being opened up, you still had to be COVID-19 free for the last 7 days. So there are still restrictions in place in some of these areas. COVID-19 has demonstrated the importance of having a local team to respond rapidly and quickly to an investigation. Often our forensic IT team is called those first responders. The ability now to send people to travel on site internationally to conduct an investigation or a collection is unfortunately no longer an option, at least not for the short to medium term for many countries around the world. This does place more reliance on having a local team within country to collect that data, to host that data, to provide that review support to the lawyers and to the local investigation team. Granted though, that teams can't be everywhere at one point in time, and you can't have local teams everywhere. in every country. So hence why, as I mentioned before, a robust methodology in terms of remote collections is important. In terms of local data centers, having that local data center within a jurisdiction that restricts data transfers out of the country is also important. Two examples of that are, for example, China and Korea, where due to national laws, the potential breaking of those laws if you take data out, state secret transfers, data privacy issues, all these are something that lawyers and our investigation team must be aware of, and hence why having a local data center can alleviate that issue. Does this mean, though, that business doesn't continue? On the contrary, if anything, we've seen an increase in misconduct matters and cybersecurity threats, predominantly due to the fact that many staff are working from home and the lack of securities in that place. But again, that's a whole different topic in itself. COVID-19 has definitely put a spotlight on companies that have not invested in technology and the policies and procedures surrounding it. From a technology stance, forensic technology stance, the fraudsters are working overtime, if anything, to try to circumvent these policies and procedures laid out by companies. And it's our job to keep one step ahead of those. One obvious way to do that is through compliance, which now I'll pass the time to my colleague Chris, which will cover up on. Thanks all.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, Jeffrey, how are you?
Great. Can we basically give a warm welcome applause to Chris? They can't wait. Please go on. I'll just let you know there is a jump on registration for your session from 180 jump to 226, and YouTube and LinkedIn Live suddenly has a surge as well. So all eyes on you, Chris.
No worries, mate. We got all our colleagues to log on several times just to make sure we pumped up the numbers. Seriously though, we've heard a lot of issues from Keith and from Davin, and frankly, this pandemic has acted like a contingency planning exercise for compliance frameworks, which probably hitherto have never really been tested for survival in these circumstances. You know, whilst business continuity planning often falls under the same umbrella as security and compliance, compliance frameworks and their continued effective operation under these circumstances has never really been included in that BCP. You know, as we've heard already, investigations, from Keith, investigations for one thing must continue, even under the current circumstances with travel restrictions and so on. And the reasons for this are quite simple. I mean, companies need to be seen to act ethically. They need to maintain shareholder value. They need to stem losses and deter further unethical behavior, and also to respond to stakeholders and regulators. So compliance frameworks will need in future to place greater emphasis on understanding local nuances of undertaking investigations in the various geographies they operate. You know, what is allowed, what is not allowed in each jurisdiction, you know, and what resources they have available locally, and their understanding of those nuances and legalities when more experienced overseas investigative resources are unable to be deployed in country. You know, as Davin and Keith have made reference, this will also include how to access data, soft copy and hard copy, and individuals remotely. Connectivity and the use of personal devices. Now, as we all know, the pandemic has created an environment where more and more employees are working from home or remotely, or rather than from their usual workplaces. However, as we may all each personally have experienced, not all organizations are completely ready for this mass remote connectivity. Some are still using Windows 7, I believe. So the security and protection of data risks expand exponentially when more and more employees work remotely during these times and potentially using personal devices to connect. You know, compliance frameworks are going to need to be augmented to address and mitigate these risks. You know, testing the evolving softwares and guarding against the emerging cyber risks. You know, just for example, with regard to video and teleconferencing, a bit like this, but you know, obviously Boris Johnson was able to hold a cabinet meeting with Zoom. You know, but compliance needs to consider how secure and how private these systems are, and where such systems, or indeed individuals themselves, create recordings. How are those recordings, how do they interplay with legal privilege, as well as data privacy and state secrecy provisions across the multiple jurisdictions? In addition, often vague or indeed absent provisions in compliance frameworks relating to a company's access to company data stored on employees' personal devices needs to be urgently addressed. However, you've still got to consider the local legal requirements into privacy and the need, perhaps, in some jurisdictions to have union or government department approvals for any changes to policies contained in employee handbooks or staff manuals. Clearly, there's going to need to be some key investments in technology. We've heard from Davin already, enabling secure, compliant, remote access to networks and communications, protecting data on personal devices, or making more company devices available for remote access, and guarding against the ever-increasing threat of cybercrime. In addition, I think there are two other key areas for continued investment. Firstly, effective and trusted whistleblowing channels. Now, I've said this before, and it's often a theme, but if you look at the Certified Fraud Examiner's 2020 report to nations, it continues to highlight how most frauds come to light through tip-off. And with the second highest channel being internal audit, possibly hamstrung in their audit programs for lack of ability to travel or effectively conduct their audits remotely, the tip-off channel becomes more important than ever before. However, as the report also points out, whistleblowers a third of whistleblowers still prefer not to use the official reporting mechanism. For example, they prefer to report direct to their supervisor. Now, since remote working could impede this reporting channel, and in any case, to fully realize the benefits of the investment in the reporting mechanism, companies must ensure the mechanism is effective and trusted by the employees. Secondly, with remote working and fragmented compliance teams under stress to continue to prevent and detect unethical behavior, now more than ever, we need to make investments in technology-assisted monitoring and more use of forensic data analytics. I feel a little bit like a stuck record there. But, to ensure the efficiency of compliance efforts by trained compliance teams, as well as investments into emerging real-time monitoring software. Now, these things are required urgently. Now is not the time to cut the budget for compliance. And finally, my last two, you can change the slide, thank you. Training and communications. Training and communications will need to be revisited in the compliance frameworks for the new normal. Instilling a culture of compliance has always been at the heart of a compliance framework, but with teams working remotely or in fragmented fashions, a vacuum in culture may be created. The effectiveness of training and the frequency of communication will come under spotlight in the redesign or strengthening of compliance frameworks post-pandemic. Even our own fraud investigations training, which we conduct, relies heavily on teamed, worked examples and case studies. And we will need to think about how best to adapt that to take account of the social distancing and remote nature of future work environments. Finally, with potential delays and inefficiencies being created in the timetable for undertaking investigations, compliance teams are going to need to better prioritize fraud alerts through case assessment and triage. This will involve a reappreciation of the company's fraud risk universe, weighting risk and categorizing fraud into levels of threat to the organization, widening and lining up internal resources, those dedicated to low-level threats and those dedicated to external threats, providing better training to those resources and those required to undertake the assessments of the fraud alerts and allocate and control the investigations. We've always said that the design and implementation of compliance frameworks is an iterative process. COVID-19 is another iteration. That's all it is. So Jeffrey, I'm going to hand back to you now to moderate the Q&A session. We're going to try and fit all three of us on the camera, which could be fun.
Thank you so much. I'll just wait everyone's on board first and such. 1 second, let me see. Do you want the PPT to be basically continue show, or can I turn it off now?
You can turn it off now.
Okay, so let's just basically focus on the rock star right now. Okay, so it's actually ironic because 3 or 4 months ago, I met 3 of you. We basically did the interview for my documentary. Chris, you mentioned a lot on the new risks. On that time, to be fair, I'm not so sure these new risks really emerge. How do you predict it? Because everything you talk about 3 or 4 months ago, it basically literally just happening right now. Compliance team have to basically now rethink and redo all their compliance program because of this pandemic.
Well, if you go back 3 or 4 months, I mean, we were already predicting that there was going to be significant financial strain in this part of the world, resulting from the downturn in businesses, resulting from the trade war, and just other environments. I mean, Hong Kong itself obviously faced many months of disruption leading up to that in any case. We weren't predicting that there would be a pandemic. But what we're seeing, of course, is that financial stress being accentuated and spread worldwide. What we were saying at that time was that when there is this type of financial stress, businesses come under pressure, and unfortunately some management will rationalize themselves that unethical behavior is allowable. We then have this situation where compliance teams are under stress through either remote working or inability to team, so that compliance programs are potentially at risk of failing. And this then produces a kind of perfect storm for this type of fraud scenario. I mean, Keith also has witnessed a lot of this in the most recent months in terms of additional fraud risks being exposed.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this will come out in the next few months. I mean, obviously, there's not that much being publicised at the moment because investigations are underway. But I think over the course of the coming months and obviously years, there'll be a lot of issues that have occurred during these past few months in terms of companies manipulating financial statements.
Okay, Keith, sorry to interrupt. I mean, what type of wrongdoing do you foresee that resulting from this financial crisis specifically?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, manipulation of financial statements, so people, overstating their revenues, understating their costs, manipulating those financial statements to present a better picture than usual, and the paying of bribes in order to win business, to beat their competitors. They've got to differentiate themselves somewhere, and they've got to try and stay alive as businesses. They're going to be doing things that, as Chris mentioned, ethically they wouldn't do otherwise. And employees are going to be under pressure. They're going to be not getting bonuses. They might be working 3 days a week. They're going to be looking to supplement their pay packet any way they can. So they'll be, committing expense fraud and, setting up third-party procurement agents that they can funnel their purchases through and cream off some money there. All these types of schemes are going to be underway if they weren't already.
Okay, so people are basically preparing for scheme at the moment. So the questions go to you, Davin. You know that most of the employee right now are working from home or remote or somewhere, etc. and that sort of thing, and it's very, very hard to basically collect information. And if the if the compliance and legal team are preparing to mitigate this risk, what can they do now to ensure that the data they will be collecting later are accurate and legal?
As I said before, often with these companies, they need to make sure that they know where their assets are, know where the data resides. We are running a couple of investigations now where we do have to collect from custodians who are actually working from home. So being able to liaise with them, being able to capture that data in a timely manner. Sometimes that data is personal data, so negotiating and navigating with legal counsel, consent to collect that type of data is critical.
But you can't really can you go to someone's home and collect it? They actually have to hand it over voluntarily. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways. For example, we've been able to collect WeChat data remotely, and without going into too much technical secret source data information, there are ways to do it remotely. We've had to use the means of, for example, web conferencing and recording those web conferencing with the consent of the individual, just to, again, ensure that the integrity of that whole process is conducted, so it can't be challenged later on, because you're right, it has to be done remotely.
Okay. I know that, maybe later on there will be a lot of investigation. Like this morning, when we talked to Ben, when we talk about review, etc., and sort of thing, and also the report that I read from DOJ, that there will be a number of antitrust issue, as well as bribery and investigation issue. If you guys have to, if a company or basically the audience saying that actually, how do we basically conduct interview now when people are working from home or remotely and we basically can't get access to them?
Yeah.
How do we conduct interview, investigation interview per se?
Yeah, as I said earlier, it's difficult when you're trying to conduct remote interviews, but as you say, if there's a regulator or law enforcement agency wanting to proceed with an investigation, these interviews need to take place. And, there are challenges in doing that remotely, as I say, in terms of sound issues, picture issues. And you're not going to capture as good an evidence as you would do if you were face-to-face, for the reasons I outlined earlier. It's just very difficult to look them in the eyes in the same way, to get a real feel of their body language, how they're reacting to the difficult questions that you're asking. And they've got to get out of jail free card every time they've got a difficult question that they just claim there's technical issues. They can't hear you, they can't see you. They shut the computer down, and they buy themselves time to be able to answer those questions at a later stage.
Right. So, again, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, so the other issue was around the recording of these interviews, whether you should sound record them, whether you should capture the video data if you're doing it PC. It's whereas in the past you might have thought that recording the interview was perhaps a bit aggressive. Frankly, in this sort of remote circumstances, you may not wish to make the recording, but the recording is being made anyway, and you're going to need to consider, as I said before, how does that interplay with legal privilege? Obviously, you need to make sure, in any case, if you're doing some types of interviews, that you have lawyers present. So that also, of course, involves potentially more than one remote site. But how does legal privilege interplay with recordings being made in different jurisdictions and so on? So there's plenty to think about. And I think Keith mentioned as well earlier that sometimes you may want to delay, you may not be able to, but in other circumstances you may have to try and force that the interview be done in person.
Right. It's just all basically depend on cases. Now, last two questions. One question is all about, come back to it, it's about compliance. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we also basically conducted a number of webinars on compliance issue and also cyber risk issue. A lot of questions are raised that the whole landscape of dealing with vendor has changed. Some of this vendor has disappeared. Some of the company that basically work with is gone, or the C-level is being terminated. And all of these basically created a lot of contractual issue and dispute issue, and also compliance issue as well. What is your advice now for the compliance team if they basically now have to rework and basically rethink how they basically do business in Asia Pacific, especially cross-border mechanism?
Crikey, it's a big question, Jeffrey. Clearly, if you've got one of the pressures that comes out of that pretty obviously is that there will be new supply, which means that you ensure the client is going to need to ensure that adequate business intelligence, adequate background research is being done as usual on third parties. The risks that Keith kind of mentioned is that those new vendors could just be window companies where beyond that there are other companies that you're unappreciative of, and it's possible that procurement risks in terms of kickbacks and so on may arise. I mean, at the other side of this, by the way, of course, is the sales side and the concerns that we may see greater channel stuffing type frauds into the future as well.
Okay, and also, like you said just now, I mean, you raise a good questions. They might basically set up a new company and also doesn't know who is the ultimate beneficial owner, and also raise a lot of questions on sanction as well. Am I correct?
Sanctions also, agree.
Yeah,
it's always very important to know where your suppliers are based and where they're trading from. Okay,
last question. So a lot of cybersecurity problem right now. People working from home, their wireless routers are not secure, and they can actually penetrate into their remote server, etc., and that sort of thing, and stealing all the data. In Australia, there's 4 companies, large organization, including government agency, is being hacked, all basically through vulnerability from the employee working from home. One of the companies got hacked twice, January and one in March this year. So what can they do?
Yeah, I think that there's several things that a company could address. I think firstly, ensuring that their software within their corporate environment, so the laptops that they issue staff, are obviously updated. Some companies might not even have antivirus software. So obviously that whole realm of updating a software or purchasing software to, I guess, mitigate the risk of cybersecurity issues. And then awareness. I think employee awareness is critical also. Often they might use a personal machine to access a VC, to inadvertently, to try to be efficient. They don't have their company machine with them at home. Use a personal machine. What is the company doing in terms of compliance there? What are their policies and procedures in place? Have they addressed BYOD? All those measures need to be addressed. And fundamentally, it still boils down to potentially the technology side. Is the company putting that investment in to the technology to harden their perimeters, if you want to say virtually, to ensure that you can mitigate and restrict that risk? But you're right. We've seen in the last 3 weeks, we've had 3 clients call us with regard to cybersecurity breaches.
Okay. Look, this is, again, it's a tough time for everyone. So all this wasn't planned, but it was predicted 3 months ago when we do the interview with all the new risks and stuff and that sort of thing. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for the great insights. If you basically, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to reach out to Davin, Keith, and Chris, please feel free to visit their website, Alvarez Marsal. They're basically under the dispute and investigation team. I think for now, for this week, you guys are the most popular sessions. We have 200 plus people listening, and also plus 100 plus from YouTube and 100 plus from LinkedIn. I don't have the data for LinkedIn because I'm not allowed to touch it. But on the topic of cybersecurity, we are going to move on to our next session on data privacy. So for the last session, on session 4, please log on to the session on your top right left-hand side, and you can just go in there. Can we basically get thank you applause to Keith, David, and Chris for great presentations and insight they shared today? Thank you.